Good evening, everyone joining us tonight. Just hang tight and we are going to start. Just a reminder to mute yourself as you enter, please. Someone just started lighting fireworks outside my window, Stacy, and I was like, no.
Guy, I didn't hear him.
Of all nights, please don't start your fireworks. But it stopped, so fingers crossed.
That's right. I had an early morning interview last Monday morning, and we were getting some work done on our back deck, and they hadn't, because of the rain and everything, they hadn't been showing up. And then all of a sudden, the cement mixer and everything was going right outside the window. I was like, oh my gosh, what is that noise? And they were here at 7:30 in the morning and starting the cement mixer, and I'm right in the middle of a recording. I was like, oh. So, yeah, that was entertaining. So,
Always.
I know. Always the case, right?
Yeah. Just welcome if you've joined. And just if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Stacy, I know there'll be a whole bunch, please stick them in the chat. Sarah will go through the questions and pick out some lucky winners who gets their questions answered tonight, but we obviously won't be able to get to all of them, but I have popped Stacy's website in the chat so you can get hold of her if you have some burning questions and want to know more. So just make sure you've got I've got my little pad and pen out ready to go. So if you haven't already got something, please grab it. Okay, so we're just going to get started. Sarah will let people in as they arrive. We are recording. So Stacy, thank you so much for joining us. Stacy is an exercise physiologist, a nutrition scientist, an expert in sex differences, an athlete herself, a mother, which is the most important role, living in Tauranga at the moment. So thank you, Stacy, for joining me and saying yes to this chat.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So some of the topics that we're going to chat about tonight, I just want to go over with my notes in the corner here. We're going to talk about women-specific training, the awareness of periods at a young age, and how we can get that message out, how we can use our periods to benefit our training. We'll talk about menopause as well, and some hot topics, which will be nutrition and hydration. And then we'll end with some questions. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, pop it in the chat. Okay, so let's get started. Stacy, would you please give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got into this type of research?
How did I get into it? No. So my PhD actually is kind of a starting point to go back and forth. So I was doing my PhD in thermoregulation down in Otago. Ironically, it's where the only heat chamber was in New Zealand. And I was really interested to understand what was going on with hydration differences between men and women and across the menstrual cycle. Because when I was in Kona racing, there were 4 of us that ended up being in the high hormone phase, the menstrual cycle, and ended up with hyponatremia at Ironman Worlds. And the other 6 women were in the low hormone phase, either on an oral contraceptive pill in the placebo week or naturally cycling, and they had no issues, even though we had all done the same kind of training, acclimatization, had similar nutrition dialed in. And so the question that really kept popping into my head was, what's going on? And this is feeding forward from all the years prior to when I was an undergrad and was a rower and was finding similar differences. The fact that the women would all train a certain way, but we wouldn't peak the same way that the men would for particular races. And I started asking questions and I didn't get answers. I got, well, women are anomalies, so we don't often use their data. Or why do you want to study women? We don't know enough about men. And when you start digging into the literature and you start looking at the textbooks and you start looking at what's being taught in the classrooms, it's all based on male data. So as an inquisitive mind, as well as being an athlete, I kept going, well, how does this apply to me and how does it apply to my teammates? I couldn't get the answers. So that started like this path forward as an academic and as an athlete, really on the basis of trying to find out these questions for me. So the pivotal point of that particular PhD question was sort of the spin of really understanding how sex hormones affect every system of our body and really pushing that not only do sex hormones affect us differently, but if you're taking some kind of oral contraceptive pill or hormone therapy, that's a completely different ballgame in and itself. So the receptor sites within our body respond differently from those exogenous versus our natural hormones. So this is kind of the push forward. And so I started looking at hydration, created a new niche in sport nutrition with a low carbohydrate, higher electrolyte composition, especially for the female athlete. Started getting more and more involved in looking at sex differences as well as what's happening as women are aging, not just in the elite athlete, but also in the general population. How are we attenuating hot flashes? How are we attenuating some of these other vasomotor symptoms that prevent sleep? So that was a lot of the work I did at Stanford because my mentor there was the lead investigator for the Women's Health Initiative. There was a whole cascade of events that led to where I am now with regards to really kind of pushing forward the message that women aren't small men, from physiological sex differences at birth to the exposure of hormones at puberty, all the way through our reproductive years, and then after our hormones flatline. So we don't age the same way as men, we don't respond the same way as men. And from the linear algorithms that are all written for training, and especially the periodized approach, it doesn't work except for maybe 2 weeks out of the month when we are low hormone like men.
And is it true that your sport was ultra running?
I did dabble in ultra running, I should say. So I started as a ballerina and then got into cross country running. And when I went to university, I was kind of burnt out with running, and that's when I joined the crew team. But after I graduated, there wasn't any place to row. So I went back into running and got into trail running and then ultra running. I was a pacer for Western States for a few races back in the day when it was very low-key race. And then moved out of the ultra running scene when I moved back into San Francisco and got more involved in triathlon, and then did Ironman and Kona a few times. And then when I came back and was doing my PhD after the experience at Kona, I just started racing my bike because it seemed to be more time efficient. And it also was more fun because I could think about things and have a little bit of freedom without the chance of injury or drowning in cold water in Dunedin.
Love it. So you've been doing this most of your life. Your research has been dedicated to your work. So how I got to know about Stacy Sims was by reading your book, Raw. A couple of years ago, I took it out camping and went through the chapters and absolutely loved it. This book is a must-have for any female athlete. I refer to it quite a bit when I have clients that I'm coaching, or just for myself. But it talks about the sex differences, obviously, and how we as women we need to train differently. We're not small men. So most of the studies out there have been done on males, and Stacey, I think it's quite scary that all the studies are done on males, so we're training the same way, yet we have a period and all the hormones make such a difference in what we're doing and how we recover and how we get the benefits from our training. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So one of the first things to remember is that we do have sex differences at birth. So we have the XX versus XY. So when I talk about women in this context, I'm always talking about the biological sex differences. And we know that from that, women have a greater predisposition for using free fatty acids in the muscle because we have more protein within the mitochondria to be able to use and burn fatty acids. We end up using more blood glucose and not muscle glycogen when we're doing exercise. So we spare it more. And that is not an offset of hormones, but an offset of our sex differences. We also have smaller hearts, smaller lungs, and less blood volume. So those are all considerations that aren't taken into account from the early research days. And a lot of our guidelines are based on that early research from that 18 to 22-year-old college age man. So when we start looking at all the protocols really that are out there with regards to training protocols, training principles, practices, nutrition guidelines, I get really upset when I talk about the carbohydrate guidelines for athletes because me being me on one day, looked at all 157 references in there. And of all of those, there were only 16 that were appropriate for women, and none of them had anything to do with carbohydrate. So if we're talking about the position stand guidelines for carbohydrate intake, that is so endemic for dietitians, nutritionists, even coaches to use and say you need X amount of carbohydrate if you're doing this kind of training, it has nothing to do with female physiology. So when we start looking forward and going, well, why does it really matter? We do have this thing called the menstrual cycle, right? So at the onset of puberty, we start to see these changes. We see girls who drop out of sport because their hips widen, their shoulder girdle widens, their center of gravity is off. They become more ungangly, they slow down, and to top it all off, then they get a period. So that's puberty for girls. But puberty for boys is completely different, where they lean up, they get fitter, they get faster, they get stronger, they get more aggressive, and they have all the attributes which we think of as sport. So when we start seeing these dichotic differences, the onset of puberty, and understanding that it's a hormone responsibility or the hormones that are causing these changes, we should really look at embracing it and understanding that it's a temporary blip in time. And what we should be doing is reteaching the basic biomechanics. We need to reteach how to throw, how to run, how to land, how to jump. If you're a swimmer, swim stroke, because these are new bodies girls are experiencing because we have differences in our angles now. And we know that when that happens, and they focus on that, that the other changes that are also occurring with the increase of body fat and body composition changes are not as negative and impactful on performance because the girls are focusing on functional movement, learning new drills, and becoming faster in that capacity. So when this downturn of performance is happening around puberty, they're covering it by building basic strength, functional movement, relearning. So the hormones have less of an effect. After puberty, when we get into our more reproductive, our standard reproductive years, and we have that 28 to 35 day menstrual cycle, the first day of bleeding we call day 1, and then around day 13 or 14 is ovulation. After that is a high hormone phase. So when we're looking at hormone shifts around there, in the low hormone phase from day 1 to around day 13, we're more like men. So a lot of studies will include women in this low hormone phase because metabolically we are similar to men with regards to being to access carbohydrate. We recover similar to men with regards to our way our muscles can repair and recover. But right before ovulation, we have an estrogen surge, we have an LH surge. This is why the egg is released, estrogen comes down. With that ovulation, then we now have progesterone that comes up. And the second half of the cycle is where we see a lot of perturbations because every cell in our body can be affected by estrogen and progesterone. Receptor sites are everywhere in our body. So when we have estrogen that comes up and progesterone comes up, we start seeing metabolic shifts where we start relying more on free fatty acids rather than the carbohydrate. Our core temperature goes up, so our heat tolerance is affected. our sweat rate is shifted. So we tend to vasodilate first and then start sweating. We end up being in a more catabolic state because progesterone's job is to break down fuel, amino acids, carbohydrate to provide building blocks for the endometrial lining. So its job is to break down things. So when we're trying to recover from a hard workout, we've done some heavy strength training where you're trying downhill running. All of these things are perceptibly harder when progesterone is elevated because we have a hindrance in recovery. But the big thing I want to point out is there is a complete difference between training and performance. We know that there's not a negative point in the menstrual cycle for performance because the psychological supersedes the physiological. This is why we don't tell people, oh, yeah, you're 4 days out from your period, you're in the high hormone phase, you're not going to have a great race, because there are things you can do to mitigate some of the hormonal effects. And again, from sports psychology and athletic mindset, we know that you can push through. But for training, we can harness the power of these hormones to improve our training capacity. So in the low hormone phase, from day 1 to around ovulation, this is where our body can be really resilient to stress. So we can have hard, intense workouts. We can work on that top end VO2, sprint capacity, and really recover from it well and adapt well. Around ovulation, some women feel flat, some women feel bulletproof, and you take advantage of that because with estrogen in isolation and that surge, it's very anabolic. So this is time to hit it hard one more time. So you can recover well, build tissue, and then feed forward. After ovulation, it's more steady state because our body's gone through this metabolic shift. We can't hit high intensities very well because we're not able to access as much carbohydrate. We're clearing out our blood glucose first. And so this is why when you're trying to do a track workout and you're like a week or so away from your period starting, you're like, what's wrong? I just can't pick it up on what's going on. It's because you need just to take in a little bit of carbohydrate so that you can top up your blood glucose and be able to hit those intensities. And then a few days before your period starts, your hormones start to drop. And with this drop, you have an increase in inflammation. And with that increased systemic inflammation, again, it's harder to recover, but it's also harder to hit high intensities. And a lot of times people are like, no, I can't because I have PMS and I don't feel that great. And that's fine. Those are all part of the lived experiences. So when you're looking at how the hormones flux, it's like we look and periodize heavy, hard, high intensity work in the low hormone phase, one last major hit around ovulation. Then we go into more steady state work, and then we go in and we look at a deload or technique work so that we're not wasting time, but we're working with our physiology. We're learning skills, drills, having a little bit of deload so that when we get into that high intensity, we're able to hit it hard again with better skill and development.
And exactly that, through your book, I learned how to read my own menstrual cycle, and I can definitely tell when I'm in that high hormonal phase, kind of that week before I have my period, when I actually bleed. So that week beforehand, if I'm not feeling quite right, it's not like it's an excuse to not push it hard. It's just that I'm more aware about my body and what I might need to cut back on, or I've got to hydrate a bit more, try and get more sleep and really look after myself. And then once I actually have my period and the hormones go down, I've noticed that is when I can push the workouts, do a bit more plyometric, hill bounding stuff, the harder intensity core work. So that really did help me to accelerate my training on the low hormonal phase.
Nice.
But also the understanding that being in that horrible spot for me personally of the high hormonal phase. So using that in my training plan. I know there'll be a lot of women on here that are on a contraceptive pill. How does that work with the whole system, and do you have the phases, the high hormones and low hormones?
No, so the most popular prescribed one is a combined oral contraceptive pill. And in New Zealand, they're monophasic. So it's 3 weeks of the same level of estrogen and progesterone. Now, the synthetic hormones affect the body differently. First, they downregulate your natural cycle. So you're not producing your own ovarian hormones. So it's medically induced ovarian failure. It's reversible, of course. So I'm just trying to explain that your natural estrogen and progesterone are completely flatlined. When we're looking at how an oral contraceptive pill kind of works across the body, the first 4 days of the active pill, we can recover really, really well because it takes time for the exogenous hormones to kind of build up in the system. So we see, really good HRV responses. We see really good sleep. We see reduced inflammation. We have better oxidative capacities. But when we are looking at how that accumulates, by the end of day about 13 or 14 on the active pill, we start to see impacts on recovery, where someone who's on an oral contraceptive pill needs more recovery per unit of strain as compared to someone who's naturally cycling on that same equivocal day. So it's the accumulation of these hormones that are starting to have more of a negative impact. So by the end of the 3rd week of the oral contraceptive pill active hormones, we have really compromised recovery and we have a higher oxidation and inflammatory, I guess, quagmire that's going on as compared to naturally cycling. And then when you start taking the sugar pill, the first 2 days as those hormones are starting to taper out, we still have a little bit of compromised recovery, but we're starting to see, hey, wait, our HRV is responding really well, we're getting better sleep, so then we can hit it hard. So it's the bookends of the pill weeks that we want to hit it really hard and take advantage of it. And then in the middle, it's more of a steady state into technique. So with the natural cycle, we just kind of see which way do I go? This way, where high intensity down to deload. But on an oral contraceptive pill, it's the bookend. So you're like, okay, high intensity where my wrists are, and it's kind of a steady state in the middle.
Okay. Hopefully that'll guide some of the ladies on here that might be on some contraceptive pills. Sorry, what were you going to?
I was going to say, and I know I'll get questions on like the implant or the depot or the IUD. So the implant and the IUD are similar in the fact that you can still have your own natural estrogen circulating. If you are on a progestin-only IUD, so the Mirena, the Skylar, the Keylar, you'll still have a residual amount of your own natural progesterone as well. So you can track your cycle by using basal body temperature. About 6 months after insertion of an IUD, you'll start ovulating again. So it's really easy to use BBT or over-the-counter ovulation predictor kit and dial it in as if you were naturally cycling. With the implant is a little bit more difficult because it's hit or miss on if you're going to ovulate for the first year. But then we know that in the last 2 years of the implant, most women will start to ovulate and you can track again using basal body temperature. If you are on the Seasonique, which is the pill pack where you take it all for 4 months and then you take a break or you just double up the packs, we don't have a lot of research on that as regards to recovery, strain, and how it affects athletic performance. We can extrapolate from the evidence we have of the more you are taking active pills, the higher that baseline is and the worse recovery you have. So I always counsel my athletes to think about why you need to be on contraception. Do you need to have an estrogen and progesterone combination, or is that something your GP has said because that is the go-to? To consider using an IUD. It's the most effective means of birth control and it has the least effect on your natural cycle and your athletic ability. If you aren't comfortable with using an IUD, then think about the progestin-only mini pill because again, that has the least systemic effect on your own like rhythm and cycle and training. So we know that on progestin-only mini pill, it's the few days before your period starts that you actually have better recovery than a naturally cycling woman, because the progestin of that pill modulates your own natural progesterone. So lots of different choices and things out there, and I
Yes.
haven't done it quite justice because I don't want to give too much time to it. But the biggest question is to ask yourself why you're on it, and is there a better option if you are trying to achieve your athletic potential?
Now, another question I have, which is quite common when it's around that menstrual cycle, is the fear of, I'm going to get my period on event day, or the long important run that you have to be out there doing. So what would you say to that?
I know. I'll tell you what, though, out of all of my race career, I feel like every major world event, my period would come. And I'd be like, ah. But in actuality, it's one of the best days to be racing because your hormones have dropped. Aside for women who have heavy menstrual bleeding and don't really realize they have it, there is a subset of about 35% of female athletes who have menorrhagia, which is really heavy menstrual bleeding for the first 2 to 3 days of their period. But there's help for that. That's not normal. And I don't think a lot of people know what normal is, because we talk about having a period, but we don't actually talk about the nuts and bolts of what that means. So if you have heavy menstrual bleeding, then you can go to your GP and get some help. Most of the time, they'll recommend a progestin-only mini pill or the IUD. IUD tends to be the best option because it reduces the thickness of the uterine lining and goes from heavy menstrual bleeding to a very light bleed, and some women don't even have a period yet, or a period with it. But when we come back to race day comes, I get my period. You should feel empowered about that, because having your period means that your endocrine system and everything is all a go with your heavy training. So that's great. Um, I'm a fan now of like period pants, period underwear. Um, Pushing now for aid stations to have menstrual products, feminine products there. But the biggest thing is don't worry about it, right? It's not going to impact negatively on your performance. And like I said, if you think it will, then it probably will. But from a physiological standpoint, your body's like, sweet, let's dial it up and go. It is the sociological concern of blood leaking and all of those kind of uncomfortable stigmas that we have around it. But like for doing Ironman or ultras or something, it's the idea of, well, how can I be prepared? Like you're not going to stop and change a tampon in the middle of a race. It's like looking at using period underwear or a thicker chamois for racing, cycle racing and stuff. And I know it sounds really not so hygienic, but in the moment of racing, none of us are overly hygienic. And the fact that we're sweating and we got everywhere, right? But the biggest thing is don't be afraid. And it's becoming
Yeah.
more and more of a empowerment symbol. There are a lot of women who are just like, I'm bleeding and I'm racing, whatever. So I want that to become the norm of the conversation here in New Zealand, because there's still a big stigma around having your period here.
And it's just, it brings us back to that awareness and teaching our girls young that it's just, your body is changing its hormones, and that's okay. And as adults, and in New Zealand, we still think it's a bit of a taboo word when you talk about periods and menstrual cycles and bleeding and all those kinds of things. And we want to, just share our own experiences and get the message out there that it's all good, and we need to say periods and
Your period is an ergogenic aid is one of the taglines that we've kind of have decided for quite a few reasons. One, it allows us to talk about it in a sport content. So a lot of male coaches, male athletes, when you say your period is an ergogenic aid, they're like, what? And that opens up the conversation to say, if I have my period, then I know that I'm not in low energy availability, I'm not in red S, I'm not at risk for injury or illness, because I'm able to have a functioning endocrine system as well as take on training stress. So we say the mark of having your period means that you are a healthy, naturally cycling athlete. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but I'm talking about in the middle of the outliers. So it's one way of broaching that conversation and breaking down those barriers. And when we start talking about it in a positive aspect in the sporting context. But on the fringes out there where people are still like, ooh, don't talk about your period. Don't, Aunt Flo's here, don't talk about it, or my mate's here. It's just taking that out of that quietness and context and saying, well, it's not my mate. It's actually, if women didn't have a period, then none of us would be here, right? It's just being a woman. It's just part of that biological process.
Yeah, exactly. Love it. So everyone that's on this Zoom tonight, make sure that you spread the word out there and just make it normalize the word, I think is the key. Okay, so next topic, real interest of mine. I'm actually doing the course on the 5th of November, Stacy's course on menopause. So I wanted to chat to you about peri and post menopause. Obviously, me as a coach, I want to learn more. And for my journey, I'm 46. I'm sure that I'll be going through some signs in the near future. But what are the signs that you are going through it?
Oh, so many. Now, I often encounter a lot of women in their early 40s who are like, I'm not quite understanding what's going on because the training and nutrition that I was doing even 3 years ago isn't working for me. Like, I'm getting slower, I'm putting on body fat, I'm not quite sure what's going on. And unfortunately, the response is often to train harder and eat less, which is a huge mistake. Because what's happening is we're having a changeover in the ratio of estrogen and progesterone. And like I said earlier, every cell and system of the body is affected by estrogen and progesterone. So when estrogen and progesterone start to change ratios, we might not have progesterone, then we start to see body composition changes. Because if we don't have estrogen and countered by progesterone, then we lose a stimulus for building lean mass. We increase a stimulus for putting on visceral fat, which is the deep belly fat that's associated with menopause, the menopause. We have increase in insulin resistance, and we start to have anxiety, depression, mood changes, and this is all an affect of how estrogen affects the body. When we start getting a little bit closer to that one point in time, we say happy birthday to menopause because it's actually one day on the calendar that marks 12 months of no period. So we can all have a separate birthday if we want. We know that the 4 to 5 years leading up to that one point is where we see the biggest amount of body composition change. This is where we lose our lean mass, we lose our bone density, we increase our fat mass. If we keep doing the typical training protocols that we are used to, especially if we're endurance athletes and we're doing a lot of long, slow distance and volume, we're contributing to those body composition changes because we are no longer giving our body a separate stimulus and being able to overcome it because those hormones used to allow us to overcome that exercise stress. But when we spend a lot of time in that moderate intensity zone, we're increasing our cortisol, we're increasing the stimulus to put on body fat, and we are definitely increasing the stimulus to lose lean mass. What we need to start doing when we are starting to see these changes is to really polarize our training. We need to do high intensity work. And I know there's a lot of chatter out there. Perimenopausal women shouldn't do high intensity because it increases cortisol. But the follow-on story to that is if you're doing high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, the acute response afterwards is, yes, a slight increase in cortisol, but a bigger increase in free testosterone that then takes the cortisol out of play. So we end up with better growth hormone responses and better testosterone, which can then subsequently be converted into our estradiol or E2, what we think about as estrogen, which helps stimulate lean mass development. We also need to think about jump training. So not just running. Running is not a significant amount of impact to help with our bones. We need to do plyometric work, 10 minutes of jumping, maybe 2 or 3 times a week to get multi-directional stress for bone density. because we're losing estrogen and progesterone that's responsible for bone turnover and bone health. So we have to find that external stress. And of course, my other tagline that everyone's probably heard is lifting heavy, but heavy stuff carefully, not being afraid to get in the gym. It's really, really, really difficult for women to become bulky. And when you're perimenopause, it's really, 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 really difficult to become bulky. But what it does do is when we're lifting heavy, it stimulates neuromuscular response for power. We want to keep that because estrogen stimulates the myosin chain in the muscle, which is responsible for the fast contraction. So when we lose estrogen, we also lose the stimulus for that fast contraction. So we want to replicate that by lifting heavy. But heavy, of course, is relative. I'm not going to tell everyone on this call to go in and try to deadlift 100 kilos. If you're not comfortable in the gym, you're not comfortable under the bar, then you phase yourself in. You work with someone, you do 2 to 4 weeks of learning how to move properly before you start adding load. But it's really super important to really polarize the training, add the resistance training and the plyometric work in, because that's how you're going to see body composition improvements, how you're not going to see that increase in fat mass and decrease in bone that's so endemic in perimenopause and menopause. It's counterintuitive to so many people who are endurance athletes, but our bodies from birth are already predisposed to being able to go long and slow. We have the mitochondrial proteins that allow us to use and store more fat. Our biomechanics also enable us to be endurant. And now that we are losing our hormones are flatlining, there's a greater stimulus to keep fat. What we need to do is we need to do these polarized trainings in order to mix it up and cause an epigenetic change that allows our body to store carbohydrate and use carbohydrate effectively, to get a stimulus for building lean mass, get a stimulus for building bone. And then we look at how are we going to actually periodize this in, and we look and say, okay, we have 2 weeks on, and in those 2 weeks, we're really focused on the intensity and lifting heavy. And I have some triathletes and ultra runners like, what do you mean I can't do a long run in the middle of the week? I'm like, you go, you lift heavy, and then you get on the treadmill and you do some short intervals, because then what you're doing is you're taking the fatigue from lifting heavy and putting it into your running, and you're learning how to run more effectively because you're able to work on your form when you're on the treadmill at a higher tempo and a higher pace. So then at the end of 2 weeks, when we have our deload week and we go out for our very easy, embarrassingly slow, long run, you can put that into practice and you see how much faster and better you feel for working on the technique and the heavy load. And again, it's a huge mind shift for so many women, especially in the ultra endurance world. But when we look at the fastest rising population in the ultra world, it's women. It's peri and postmenopausal women, because now physiology is telling them, well, you can't be fast anymore. You can't be explosive anymore. But here, let's do ultra endurance events. And the body is primed to go long and slow. But the problem is, the more you do long and slow, the more your body becomes in tune to going long and slow, and you keep getting slower. So we need to really look at polarizing it, mixing it up to get all of those positive changes we want, from cardiovascular health all the way to performance. And our love for endurance doesn't get thrown out the window. We just have to be very strategic of where we put in those long days. I have my ultra runners, will do the 2 weeks of intensity. They'll have a couple of days of really dialing it down, deloading, and then we'll have back-to-back 2 days on the feet of really long, slow, embarrassingly easy days. So they're getting the time on the feet that's necessary for doing ultra running.
I'm forever trying to get my runners to do more strength work. So hopefully after tonight, they know how important that is. And as we age, looking holistically at your training plan, not just running all day long. We need the strength in there. So also protein, is that something we need
Yes.
to increase?
Yes, across the board. So again, as I was talking about the carbohydrate guidelines, the guidelines for protein that are out there, we hear what 0.8 gram per kilogram is the max in that you should get as a recreational female. That is based on sedentary men. So what they've done is they looked at the spectrum and said, okay, well, very active resistance trained men between 2 and 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And then we look at the sedentary men who don't do anything, like just for nitrogen balance, we're getting around that 0.8 gram per kilogram of body weight. Oh, and women should probably do that too because they don't build muscle like men do. But when we start digging into the research, it's wrong. So there's newer research that's come out and said if you are a heavy resistance female athlete, heavy endurance female athlete, you need to be in the middle to the upper end, just like men, because of the damage and the turnover that happens. But not only that, with aging, we know that women don't age linearly like men do because we have peri and postmenopause, right? So that's a big, huge blip in our aging time point. And when we hit that perimenopause, especially those 4 to 5 years before our happy birthday menopause date, our body's under a lot of stress and we need more protein. And we're also becoming anabolically resistant because estrogen's taking a nosedive. So we need to back up all of our heavy training with good hits of protein in order to increase the amount of circulating amino acids. And when we look for the eye of building lean mass, when we have estrogen working for us, there are 4 pathways to turning on what we call the mTOR complex 1, which is the feedback mechanism for actually developing muscle protein and muscle fibers. When we lose estrogen, we only have 2 pathways. And those 2 pathways is physical activity and amino acid supply. So if we lose those 2 of the 4 pathways, we really have to maximize what we're doing for that lean mass. So I've already talked about the stimulus from lifting heavy and the plyo work and the heavy or the high intensity. We need to back that up with more circulating amino acids. So for women post-exercise, we're looking at that 35 to 40 grams of equivalent of whey protein isolate. So that's around a 5 or 6 gram leucine hit. And not taking leucine powder, but looking at whole proteins that can allow you to get that leucine. So it's also around 40 to 45 grams of pea protein isolate for people who are plant-based, and you need that after exercise. And then from your meals, you want to space out your meals with regular doses of around 30 grams of good quality protein so that we keep amino acids circulating not only for our cognitive and neuromuscular abilities, but also for keeping the stimulus for lean mass development. And unfortunately, women are really astounded by how much protein they actually need because we've been all focused on these recommendations of that 0.8 grams per kilogram is enough, and it is half of what we need.
Okay. And you're very much about reaching for real food before you go for the powders.
Yeah, there is a time and a place. I mean, I use protein powder, of course, especially when we can travel, but I can't travel. Because, yeah, I'll admit it's hard in busy days to get that much food. And after a hard run or something, you feel hungry and you know that you need it. I'm always notorious for a protein coffee after training and sometimes before training, where you're taking a cold brew, 2 tablespoons of protein powder and some nut milk or normal milk. And it's like my post-exercise, shove it down because I'm getting protein. And we also know that caffeine also helps with recovery. So it's a 1-2 hit. And then I start to feel hungry about an hour and a half later, and then I know I still have a window of opportunity to get more protein and carbohydrate in. So it's being a little bit strategic when you're not hungry, but knowing that you need it.
And it's that, is it 90-minute window in which you need to be getting that protein hit? And yeah.
For post-exercise, it's a 30-minute window, but if you have it within 30 minutes, it opens up your recovery window another hour and a half. So overall, you'll have a 2-hour window.
Okay. Right. Next question. I realize the time is flying by, so I want to touch on hydration and nutrition with you. Now, hydration, I received your latest email where you talked about hydration is power, how women heat up a lot sooner than men and sweat less. I'm really bad at hydration, so this is quite a concern for me when I read the email. Also, with summer looming, and we have to take into consideration the elements that we're going to be training in. And of course, it's all very individual as to how much we need. Can you just talk a little bit about hydration and electrolytes?
Oh, yes. We could do a whole nother hour on just that topic. Because remember, I started as a thermoreg physiologist. So when we talk about hydration, a lot of people are like, oh, I have my water bottle, I'm drinking all day. But you don't hydrate that way. Because when you drink a lot of plain water, you end up peeing it out because your body's like, wait a second, I can't absorb all of this. So you end up peeing out more than you take in. Just adding a little bit of salt to your bottle of water that's sitting by you is going to help you absorb it. And you'll end up drinking less, but staying hydrated. When we're talking about like race nutrition or training nutrition, and we're talking about hydration products that are on the market, there is a huge history and misstep, and marketing is stronger than science. So we look at the existing sports drinks that are on the market. They're too high in carbohydrate to actually help you hydrate. They effectively dehydrate you. What I mean by that is if you're looking at something like Gatorade, Powerade, CarboPro, Tailwind, they all have too much stuff in it. So when you actually drink it, it sits in the small intestines and increases the pressure in the small intestines. And the way your body responds to that pressure is pulling water from other spaces to dilute it in order for it to be absorbed. The small intestines is very particular to how much pressure it can handle. It sits around 200 to 250 milliosmoles, so it's below blood. So when you're drinking Tailwind, or you're using gels in water, or you're using Gatorade or Powerade, or these, or even Pure, which talks about being lower, it's not. It's still a 5%. We want something that's around a 3.5% solution, so 3.5 grams of carbohydrate per 100 mil. This is optimal carbohydrate, and you want the carbohydrate to be a mix of dextrose, which is also glucose, and sucrose, because two sugars are better than one for activating all your fluid transport mechanisms, and sucrose gets broken down into fructose and glucose. So fructose is often a GI perturbance for women, but when it is rate limited because you've taken it in as that mixed sugar, then your body knows what to do with it. But so many of the sports drinks out there are maltodextrin and fructose and glucose based on male data. But when we look at what's happening with the female gut and the fact that we have a higher incidence of gut perturbance, we have a faster ratio of mucosal lining erosion when we start exercise. And then we have this thing called estrogen that also perturbs our gut. We need to be very cognizant of what we're doing to actually hydrate. So the other thing to remember is that you want to get your nutrition from something you're pulling out of your pocket, and you want your hydration to be what's in your bottle, because you don't have a huge capacity for carrying hydration with you. So you want to make sure that it actually works with your body to absorb it. The sports drink industry is a 15 to $20 billion industry. So of course they're going to say, no, you need carbohydrate and fuel all in one bottle. It's great, especially if you're an ultra runner or you're a cyclist and you need to top up on carbohydrate. But all of these issues that we see with ultra endurance of the porta potty stops, the diarrhea on the side of the road, the gut intolerance, and oh, I'm cramping, I must need salt tablets. You don't need salt tablets. You need functional hydration. And when we're talking about functional hydration as well, the only two electrolytes you really need is sodium and a little bit of potassium. Usually a 2-to-1 ratio, more sodium than potassium. Because when we're talking about magnesium, calcium, B vitamins, none of that is working for hydration. You don't need that for hydration. You need sodium, water, and two mixes or two different sugars for optimal hydration. The potassium is there because the longer you go, the more potassium you need to kind of help balance out what's going on. Post-exercise, that's the time to have coconut water or something that's high in potassium. During exercise, not so much. Then we talk about salt tablets. You don't need them. It's the same thing. You're taking a concentrated compound, sodium chloride, and putting it into a gut. Body has to take water to dilute it. But the other thing is when you start exercising, your body doesn't need as much chloride. You have a tenfold decrease in the amount of chloride that your body is actually using. So when you're looking at sodium compounds in your drinks, you want a little bit of chloride, but primarily like sodium citrate, so that you can actually work with the electrolytes your body needs. So when people are like, oh, I have my salt stick and I have my gels and I have my Carbo Pro, I'm like, you're not going to finish your race. You're going to end up with GI distress. You're going to have a positive split, not a negative split. And you're probably going to cramp and you're going to be on the side of the trail or the road going, what's going on? Because your gut can't handle that stuff. That's not what's happening from a physiological perspective, what your body needs under that kind of exercise stress.
That is mind-blowing information, I'm sure, for some viewers tonight, especially about the sports drink and what we've got to know about it. And, you know, you go to an event, as you know, everyone's got their own powder, their special powder that they use, or tablets. And so what do you suggest as in more natural form that you would make up yourself?
Super easy.
We like that.
I know. In a 750 ml bottle, you can put in 1/16 a teaspoon of normal table salt. That gives you around 200 milligrams of sodium, and 1 to 2 teaspoons of maple syrup, because then you have glucose and sucrose and some potassium from the maple syrup. That's all you need. It shouldn't taste salty and it shouldn't be overly powerfully sweet, but that's functional hydration. It's around a 1.5% solution, 200 milligrams of sodium, and it's exactly what your body needs when you are exercising and trying to hydrate.
Nice, and it's cheap. So
Very. Joe, that was 1/16 of a teaspoon. Sorry.
Okay. We will move to nutrition for female athletes. So you support women to actually eat
Yes.
in training in general,
Yes.
and that is pre and post. This is a real big question that I get asked a lot, and that is about, you know, do I eat breakfast beforehand, and how long beforehand? And I'm not going to eat in the actual event or the run because that'll upset my tummy. Is it better to wait until the end and to have some protein? What's your take on nutrition?
Fuel for what you're doing before, during, and after. And the reason for that is your body is under stress when we're exercising, and you want to be able to supply nutrition to it when it needs it. A lot of women will skip something before because they're afraid of tummy upset. But we know that when women are doing fasted training, it's counterproductive for a myriad of reasons. One, you can't hit the intensities that you want to because you can't access carbohydrate very well. And if you don't have something coming in to boost your blood glucose, then you really can't get into the higher intensities. But the bigger issue is it starts to perturb areas in the hypothalamus where we have kisspeptin neurons. Now, kisspeptin, there are two areas in the brain for women, and estrogen and kisspeptin interplay with appetite hormones as well as energy conservation. So if you don't have food coming in under a high stress, especially carbohydrate coming in under a high stress load, it down regulates kisspeptin. And the offshoot of that is you start to reduce your thyroid and you start to reduce your endocrine system. So you'll start having menstrual cycle perturbance. You'll have a changeover in your ratio of estrogen progesterone. You'll start having a pulse of your luteinizing hormone. So you'll start to have all these effects. And then if we're not eating during our exercise, again, we're compromising our ability to hit high intensities as well as produce the power that we want. Post-exercise, super important because our body's in this big breakdown state from exercise. So if we aren't giving it nutrition at the end, when we have finished exercise, we stay in this big catabolic state. So if we're in this big breakdown state, then it signals the body that we don't have enough nutrition to handle that stress we just went into. So again, we start to have this perturbance and kispetin, downregulating it. And we know that if you are staying in this catabolic state, you end up with the signs and symptoms of low energy availability, even if you're eating adequate calories. If you're bookending your day with calorie intake, but have a hole in the day of this catabolic response, you shouldn't be training because you're not going to adapt. You're just going to get into a bigger and bigger stressed state, and cortisol levels come up. You stay in a sympathetic drive, and you get the signaling to downturn your resting metabolic rate. So we say fuel for what you are doing. Fuel before, during, and after. It doesn't have to be special food. It can be like if you have an early morning session, it can be a half a banana. And then you're having breakfast right afterwards, right? So fuel for what you're doing. And then you can look and say, well, maybe I need a little bit of calorie restriction to kind of help me get to where I want to be for race weight, even though I don't believe in race weight. It's still that mentality. Then you take out that afternoon snack, or you take out a snack after dinner. But you don't compromise fueling in and around training.
So the key is to really, have a plan, trial different foods in your training, but do it regularly, and then just assess as you go along.
Yep.
Yeah.
Especially important for women who are trying to lose a little bit of weight, because if you're not bringing calories in when your body needs it, it's counterproductive. Your body is going to hold on to that fat because it's perceived as being in a low energy state. And the first thing that goes in a low energy availability state is lean mass, and you increase your fat mass. So for women who are trying to budge and change body composition, food is super, super important. And again, it's that mind shift that we've been fed so much of calories in, calories out. Reduce your calories, increase your training if you want to lose weight. But it's such a disservice because that's not the answer. We need to fuel for the stress we are under, and then we can taper calories away from training.
So that doesn't leave much room for fasting.
No.
You do not recommend fasting.
I don't.
No.
And there have been three really, really good review and intervention articles that have been published in the past 3 months, looking at time restricted eating and fasting in normal weight individuals, both men and women. And what happens is they found those people who were doing time restricted and intermittent fasting ended up with sarcopenia, because the first thing that goes when you're in normal weight and you're doing intermittent fasting and exercising in a fasted state is lean mass. And your body's like, wait, I need to have some stores. So it starts to put in more fat because muscle tissue is very metabolically active and the body's looking at ways to conserve. So they're seeing, yeah, if you're not obese and you're not sedentary, then you don't want to do fasted training. If you are trying to do intermittent fasting for the longevity aspects that we hear so much about, exercise. Exercise is a fasted state. You still have the autophagy that comes with it. You still have the increase in telomere length because those are all exercise adaptations. So the best way to look at the calorie restriction aspect that's coming out in literature, finish dinner at 7 or 8, don't eat again until you have breakfast, unless you're training first thing in the morning, then you have a little bit. So you're giving yourself that 9 to 12 hour overnight fast, which is normal. But we've gotten so far removed from what is normal eating and normal patterns that it's come to this, everyone should be doing fasted and intermittent fasting.
It's the craze.
It is.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Awesome advice, Stacy. Now we are going to leave some room here for questions. So my lovely co-host, Sarah Neve, is going to take over, and she's had a look through the questions. So I'll just mute myself, and Sarah, take it away.
All right, sorry everyone, there's quite a few that have come through and I can't get to all of them, but just a couple that have come through that it's been a few that have repeated themselves. One was talking about how you'd approach training, one saying after a recent hysterectomy, or if you no longer menstruate, do your hormones still mimic the same kind of cycle? How does training change when it comes to that?
So if you still have your ovaries after hysterectomy, then you'll still have a basal body, or you'll still have your ovarian function. You'll still have your hormones fluctuating, so you can track basal body temperature, you can track ovulation and train according to your cycle. If you don't have your ovaries and you've had a total hysterectomy, then you're in medically induced menopause. So this is where you are looking at doing your high intensity polarized training in order to garner the benefits of body composition change and training adaptations.
Cool. Also with that, so someone's asked the best phase of the cycle to do things like speed work, and also best phase to do strength work, if there is one.
Yeah, so when we're looking at the actual menstrual cycle and we're looking at how we periodize with it, you want to do all your heavy loading, either speed work, heavy lifting, in that first around 14 days before ovulation. After ovulation, this is where you can look at strength work as being more at that 6 to 8, maybe 10 rep range. So it's more of that moderate intensity to still get benefits of resistance training, but not trying to really push it too hard. And then when we get into those few days before the period starts, this is where you're working on technique, running drills, again, trying to nail all of that stuff before you then hit that high stress period of your low hormone phase, high stress from a high training stress.
Awesome. Someone's asked about plant-based diet for training and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's great, especially now because there's so many available options for people who are plant-based. The one thing I do caution is staying away from things like the Impossible Burger, tofurkey, all the meat substitutes, because they're so highly processed. They start to affect the gut microbiome in a negative way. So if you're plant-based, it's one of the best ways to actually help your gut microbiome. And we know that a good diversity of it also enhances training adaptations, it enhances cognition, it enhances our immune system. And it's just really being cognizant of what your quality of protein is when you're doing plant-based, and not to be afraid of using things like pea isolate protein powder to help boost that overall protein intake.
Awesome. And there was a couple more. There was one about fasted training, which of course you don't really recommend. There's one about more again on kind of the hormone side of things. Someone's asked someone undergoing hormone therapy, transitioning from female to male, and how testosterone might impact that kind of thing in terms of training and nutrition.
Yeah, and this is an area that I'm really interested in. Just because of the hormone aspect, but there is not a lot of research. So it depends on what kind of compound you're using, how long you've been on the transition hormones. And when we're looking at the increase in testosterone, knowing that testosterone isn't the be all end all that people think it is, like it's not the magic bullet for increasing lean mass. It works with a lot of the other hormones. So if you're transitioning, knowing what your levels of estradiol are in conjunction to testosterone will give you better insight into how you're going to respond from a lean mass development and a recovery standpoint. What we do know, because there's such limited research right now, is keeping track. So it can be looking at your training log and writing down how you're feeling, your sleep, what your workout was, and what your dosage of your hormone therapy is and you can start to see patterns. And as you're seeing patterns over the course of 3 to 4 months, you'll be able to dial in what days you can really hit it hard and what days you might need to dial it back.
Awesome. Just one more, a couple have come through. Questions about fueling for long runs in terms of real food.
Oh, what to eat on a long
Yeah.
run? If I was in the States, I'd say grab some payday bars, but I don't think they have those here. So one of the things that's really easy to do is if you grab a bag of like trail mix, or you can get some, they have the dried strawberries and raisins, get some chocolate bits, some dates, throw it in your food processor, blend it up and pull it out into little balls. So they're kind of like energy bites or bliss balls, but way cheaper. And instead of buying packs of freeze balls just to make your own. Roasted, cooled sweet potato or kumara, little new potatoes. Those are great if you roast them the night before and you have them salted and you put them in your pocket. Don't be afraid of using things like Nature's Confections, like mixed salad little lollies as well when you need a quick hit of sugar, because everyone will have a lull. So instead of using gels, you go with that, or glucose tablets. They don't really fall in the real food category, but they're way better than the engineered sport nutrition out there. There is also a time and a place for using like Cliff Bars or making your own. It's really easy to make your own when you're looking at, you can buy rice malt.
He's got literally the last one and hadn't been able to kind of get through.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I say you can buy rice malt syrup and microwave it for about a minute, stir in some nut butter, and then put in Rice Krispies and some protein powder, squish it into a pan, let it chill, and then you can melt some chocolate on top if you want. Otherwise, you have a protein fortified, moderate carbohydrate type food to take with you. Lots of things to play with. Those tend to be my go-tos, actually.
Those are great ideas. Awesome. Thank you for that. I think that's everything. Back to you, Marie.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to have you on my team tonight. So I just have a couple of questions for Stacy. One is around low iron, and I know this is a really common thing that comes up with women in general, but going through perimenopause or post-menopause, when you're in your menstrual cycle, high hormonal phase, and training as well. So iron can be quite low. Can you give us your take on iron and maybe foods you would eat or supplements?
Yeah, so the thing about iron, they don't tell women how to supplement properly. What I mean by that is when we have episodes of inflammation, so it's post-exercise for about 5 hours. In perimenopause and postmenopausal women, it's actually 24 hours. We have higher inflammation in peri and postmenopause, just systemically. But what happens in times of inflammation is we have a upregulation of this hormone called hepcidin. Now, with hepcidin up, we can't absorb iron from our gut. So we end up being on the low end of normal or following into iron deficiency, not full anemia, but iron deficiency. And they tell you to take a supplement. Here, take these iron supplements and you're going to boost your iron, or you need an iron infusion. But what we know is when you are on your period and you're bleeding, hepcidin is really low. And this is when you should be supplementing. After ovulation, hepcidin starts to come up because you have a changeover in your immune response to have more of a pro-inflammatory response. So we supplement in the low hormone phase of the menstrual cycle every other day, and your body actually absorbs it and you get on top of it. When we're talking about peri and postmenopause, where we don't have hormone flux to think about, we try to supplement every other day before training so that we don't have to wait for hepcidin to come down after training, which can be variable in perimenopause, but like I said, takes up to 24 hours in postmenopause. When we're on an oral contraceptive pill, that's primarily protective from becoming iron deficient, but you can also now be prescribed an oral contraceptive pill that has iron already in it to help boost you across the way. So it's important to understand how inflammation plays into iron and iron deficiency, and supplementing in low hormone states and in low inflammatory states.
And then my last question is someone emailed me. I'm just reading from my screen. Yeah, this lady has low iron, 3 years into perimenopause, and she's taking iron tablets. Apart from trying to eat more iron-rich foods, apart from red meat, is there anything else you can recommend?
You want to look at taking turmeric to really dampen down total body inflammation. It's really, really effective, especially in the perimenopausal state where we have this increased systemic inflammation. So turmeric is way more powerful than your over-the-counter non-steroidal. It helps attenuate that inflammation, especially in the gut, so hepcidin responses aren't so strong. So the combination of supplementing with an iron supplement, like, what is it? Not Floridex. Oh, I just blanked. It's a ferrous fumarate that's prescribed here a lot with vitamin C. Anyway, your iron supplement with turmeric is way to go when you're perimenopausal.
Okay. And she had another question about heart rate, and I'd be quite interested to know too, Stacy, about your take on heart rate for females, and because a lot of us use it in training. Is that the right thing to do for females?
Yeah, so we can rely on our heart rate in the low hormone phase, but when progesterone starts to come up, we have a change in our autonomic nervous system. So our respiratory rate goes up, our resting heart rate goes up, our heart rate variability comes down. So it looks like we're not adapting. If you're tracking your menstrual cycle and you're tracking your heart rate across the phases, you'll see the shift. So then you'll be able to understand what your heart rate should be within a working load in the different hormonal states. It stays pretty constant when you're on contraception, especially your OC. When we're looking at perimenopause, it's really hard to dial in because those ever switching estrogen ratios, progesterone estrogen ratios. So we look more at the trends, especially heart rate variability trends. Instead of actually relying on heart rate during a workout, we look more at rating of perceived exertion and using that as a better marker for the intensity rather than heart rate.
So going with a bit of tracking, but also how you feel.
Definitely.
Yeah. All righty, I think that is all the questions. I just want to thank you so much, Stacy, for coming on and doing this with me. How can people get in touch with you if they have a question or if they want to look one of your courses up?
The Dr. Stacy Sims website has a list of all the stuff I'm up to, all the courses, and yes, thank you, Bailey Farraguard. Sorry, I saw that out of the corner of my eye. And then if you have questions, you can email hello@drstacysims.com, and then that'll get forwarded to me and I'll answer you.
Oh, she's so easy to get to know and so open to us all, which is awesome. But thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your research. I think we've all got a few tips and maybe a bit of food for thought when it comes to our training. But the best of luck for you to continue your research. We love what you're doing, and I can't wait to do this course, get to know a bit more about your work and everything that you've put into your research. This menopause course will be very eye-opening for me, as tonight has been. So thank you, Stacy, from the bottom of my heart. You have made my Christmas for saying yes, and just when I needed a little bit of light at the end of our lockdown tunnel.
You're welcome. The other thing is Celine and I have a follow-up to Roar that's coming out in May. It's called Next Level, and it is all about the peri and postmenopausal state. So you can look forward to that too. So for those of you who are interested in taking the course but are under budget, I know that with the New Zealand dollar exchange rate, it can be a little bit of a tight squeeze there. The book is a good resource to have, especially yeah, the new book that comes out.
Oh, exciting. So this is the raw original #1 book. And also Stacy has a whole heap of free content. So do Google search her, and you know, we've got resources everywhere available to us with your work. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and Lee, for letting everyone in and muting everyone and looking at the questions. Really important role, so thank you. But everyone, have a good evening.
Thank you for having me.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
See you, everyone.